Hi Year 11, here is another video looking at one of the texts that you need to focus on in order to prepare for lessons and therefore your exams. So this time we're looking at the opening of a novel, and this novel is called A Child in Time by Ian McEwan, who happens to be one of my favourite writers. So we're focusing on paper 1, question 3, which is our structure question. Now remember, in order to get 4 out of the 8 marks, you must write about the beginning, the middle, and the end of the extract. You need to use subject terminology and you need to use quotations. Now, by literally summarising what happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end, using quotations and some subject terminology, you can get those 4 marks. To get 5, 6, 7, or 8 marks, we need to then be thinking about the effect, why the writer has structured it the way they have, and trying to make connections within the text as well. So we're going to have a go at doing all of those things whilst we're reading it. The main thing is to focus on this text as paragraph by paragraph. So whereas on question 2, the language question, we're looking at individual words and phrases and we're looking at language techniques. The first point here must be to think about the text in terms of paragraph by paragraph, and think about summarising almost what happens in each paragraph and what changes from one paragraph to the next. And then you can start thinking about why it changes, and that's what you need to focus on then to think about effects. So again, focusing on what changes, how it changes, and why it changes is what's going to get you the marks. The other thing that's worth paying attention to is it will always tell you sort of a little bit about the extract, and here we find out that it's from the opening of a novel. So if you're reading the beginning of a story, you're going to want it to sort of establish time, place, setting, characters, those kind of things. You might also be looking to see whether it starts in media res. Remember that means like in the middle of something. So is it like the reader is joining something sort of part of the way through, something that's already started, because if it's the beginning of the story, you would, quite rightly sort of expect it to start at the beginning of something too, rather than joining halfway through. So let's have a look at the first paragraph. Kate was holding on to the wide bar at the end of the trolley, pretending to push. There was no one behind her. Now the person immediately ahead of Stephen, a man with a curved back, was about to pay for several tins of dog food. Stephen lifted the first items onto the belt. When he straightened, he might have been conscious of a figure in a dark coat behind Kate, but it was hardly an awareness at all. It was the weakest suspicion brought to life by a desperate memory. The coat could have been a dress or a shopping bag or his own invention. He was intent on ordinary tasks, keen to finish them. He was barely a conscious being at all. So if we think about what's going on here then, straight away we can think and see that actually this text is very confusing. It's disorientating and it leaves the reader with a lot of questions. So straight away we might be thinking, well, who is Kate? And it starts in media res. It starts in the middle of something. Now, it's important that we always use quotations to back up what we're saying, even when we're talking about structure. So if we're saying that it starts in media res, in the middle of something, we want to give an example of that. Kate was holding on to the wide bar at the other end of the trolley, pretending to push. And this is what is confusing for us, because we're thinking, well, who is Kate? Where is she? And what's going on? So whilst the characters are being introduced, it then goes on to focus on people and strange details, and we don't really get a lot of more information about Kate or who she is. We know that she's here with the trolley, and that's all it really establishes. So we get this kind of clear image of Kate, and that contrasts with something that we'll read later. So we'll come back to that. So it's focusing on a man with a curved back, it's focusing on dog food, it's focusing on a figure in a dark coat behind Kate. So if we're thinking about our structure vocabulary, whilst it introduces the character, it then focuses on these peoples and strange details. So it's kind of zooming in. It zooms in on little things like the man's curved back, the dog food. And at this point, we don't really understand the significance of any of it. And the reader is feeling confused, just like this man's memories that seem to be all over the place. And the reader is also very confused. Now let's look at the next paragraph. The man with the dog food was leaving. The checkout girl was already at work, the fingers of one hand flickering over the keypad while the other drew Stephen's items towards her. As he took the salmon from the trolley, he glanced down and Kate winked. She copied him, but clumsily, wrinkling her nose and closing both eyes. He set the fish down and asked the girl for a carrier bag. She reached under a shelf and pulled one out. He took it and turned. Kate was gone. Okay, let's just read up to that point. Look up to that point. So the focus moves from the man with the dog and it shifts to this man Stephen and the checkout girl, and it's focusing really on the relationship between them. So here we had a wider focus on lots of different details, and now it's sort of either you might say focusing in on Stephen and the checkout girl. In fact, that's what I've also put here. Move that over a bit. So the focus moves from the supermarket as a whole. So here we've got a sense of sort of an overview of the whole supermarket, and now it's focusing onto this kind of the checkout queue. But also Steve's relationship with Kate. Now that's why I've highlighted that bit here, because you need to be able to use quotations, as I said earlier. So you could even have he glanced down and Kate winked, or you could have she copied him. You don't need all of that. There's kind of establishing his relationship with Kate. And we can see here that she seems to be younger. She can't really copy him exactly, and he's having to glance down at her, so she's younger. And it includes these kind of details in order to contrast with when she's gone. So if we look at Kate here, Kate was holding onto the bar of the other end of the trolley, pretending to push, and here she's still there, and he's glancing down, so he's still next to her. And then suddenly we get this contrast with Kate was gone. Now, what I've noted down here is that if this was a film, this is where you'd almost get a close-up shot. CU shot means a close-up shot of the trolley, because it's suddenly returning to Kate. So it moves from Stephen and the checkout girl to Stephen and Kate, back to Stephen and the checkout girl, and then back to Kate. So it's kind of flicking between different characters, and when we lose our focus on Kate for an instant, then suddenly she disappears. And we can't really say a lot about these pronouns. These pronouns are showing us how it's constantly changing between Stephen and the checkout girl, and we can't really say even a lot about this short sentence, because obviously all of that is going to be focusing on language. But what we can say here is this short sentence is really important because the focus shifts. So you can see this is what I've written here. The focus moves from what Stephen was doing to what Kate is doing. So here, because this paragraph is really long, we're having to look at it kind of in chunks. So this first bit is focusing on Stephen and the checkout girl, then to Kate, Stephen and the checkout girl, and then back to Kate again. So let's read on from this point. There was no one in the queue behind him, and hurriedly he pushed the trolley clear, thinking she had ducked down behind the end of the counter. Then he took a few paces and glanced down the only aisle that she would have had time to reach. He stepped back and looked at his left and right. On one side there were lines of shoppers, on the other a clear space, then the chrome turnstile, then the automatic doors on the pavement. There may have been a figure in a coat hurrying away from him, but at that time Stephen was looking for a 3-year-old child, and his immediate worry was the traffic. Okay, so whereas before we said that the focus was on Stephen and the checkout girl, the focus is now very much on Stephen himself. But whilst the focus is on Stephen himself, he's now kind of the setting is the sort of the whole of the supermarket again. So it's not just that tight focus on Stephen at the checkout. He's now kind of searching the supermarket. And it's almost like I've put here that we're seeing things from inside his head. He is thinking about things from Kate's perspective, moving the trolley out of the way, bending down, glancing down one aisle, and he moves quickly around the supermarket. So we can add here as well, though the focus is on Stephen himself, he's moving around the supermarket, and we're definitely seeing things from his point of view and what he's doing, even though this is a third person narrative. So here we've got this idea of an omniscient narrator. Remember, omniscient means all seeing, so omniscient. The narrator is not one of the characters in the story, but they're kind of all seeing, and they are able to move from different perspectives, really. So they're giving us this kind of overview, but then they're also allowing us to see things from Stephen's point of view. And then also another thing to pick up in is we've got this kind of motif here, this repeating idea. And this can sometimes be a language technique, but it can also be a structural technique. So there may have been a figure in a coat hurrying away from him. And we saw that person mentioned before. There might have been the conscious of a figure in a dark coat behind Kate. So we can't again talk about the language, how it changes from might to may, but we can talk about this repeating idea. So the figure in the dark coat is mentioned again. It's almost as if it's giving us his thoughts, maybe, maybe, maybe. But the fact that it returns here, this repeating idea, begins to create and build a sense of threat. Sorry, you can't see my notes. Let me move that up. So there's a sense of threat here. This figure in the dark coat kind of repeats, and as he repeats, the significance of this figure in the dark coat is emphasised. So hopefully you're starting to realise that what has happened to Kate. She's disappeared, and really there's this sense that maybe she's been taken. At this point, the father, Stephen, is not worried. He's just thinking he doesn't want her to run into the road. So now we can see that the figure is going to change, really. He's already kind of signalled that by saying that his worry was the traffic. So we're going to see it now shift to the outside. There was a theoretical precautionary anxiety. As he shouldered past shoppers and emerged onto the broad pavement, he knew he would not see her there. So this phrase here, where it's talking about the broad pavement, signals to us that the action is moving outside. We're now outside the supermarket. And as he moves further away from the supermarket, we begin to see that his anxiety races, his anxiety increases. He knew he would not see her there. So he's almost already got this sort of sense of dread that he knows he's not going to find her. So again, if we're thinking about this structurally, then let's recap. It starts off that Kate is there at the beginning, and the focus is very much on her. By the middle of the paragraph, middle of the extract, she has disappeared. And it then sort of very much focuses on her absence. And we've got this kind of recurring motif with the threat of the figure in the dark coat. It then moves towards, in the second half of the extract, from inside the supermarket to outside. And let's read on. Kate was not adventurous in this way. She was not a strayer. She was too sociable. She preferred the company of the one she was with. She was also terrified of the road. He turned back and relaxed. She had to be in the shop, and she could come to no real harm there. He expected to see her emerging behind the lines of shoppers at the checkouts. It was easy enough to overlook a child. In the first flash of concern to look too hard, too quickly. Still, a sickness and a tightening at the base of the throat, an unpleasant lightness in the feet, were with him as he went back. So now the focus is shifting. Sorry, I just realised you weren't able to see a lot of that as I was reading, but hopefully you can follow on. So as he went back, it's not necessarily a new paragraph, but again, that's focusing and identifying for us. It's a shift going from the outside back to the inside. And here we can see, all this time when he's focusing on the outside, we're not really getting when the text is focusing on the outside, it's not really focusing on what is happening outside. The focus is still very much Stephen's thoughts about Kate. There's not really anything else that it's focusing on there. And he's now thinking about what she may or may not do. And then it starts to build towards this climax. When he walked past all of the tills, ignoring the girl at his, who was irritably trying to attract his attention, a chill rose to the top of his stomach. At a controlled run, he was not yet past caring how foolish he looked. He went down all the aisles, past mountains of oranges, toilet roll soup. It was not until he was back at his starting point that he abandoned all propriety, filled his constricted lungs, and shouted Kate's name. And so here, this is where it's building towards a climax. He suddenly kind of loses control, or we get to this kind of realization where he kind of doesn't care anymore about everybody else. Now, the sad thing is, or not the sad thing, but we've almost got this sense of almost like dramatic irony. This motif of the figure that's been mentioned here, and then again here, means that the reader knows before him. This is when he comes to the realization that she's really gone, that she's been taken. Whereas the motif means that the motif earlier means the reader is already realized this. So the reader realizes sooner or prior to this point. And so towards the end of the extract, we get this focus on his lack of control and his fear. Now he was taking long strides, bawling her name as he pounded the length of an aisle and headed once more for the door. Faces were turning towards him. There was no mistaking him for one of the drunks who blundered in to buy cider. His fear was too evident, too forceful. It filled the impersonal fluorescent space with unignorable human warmth. Within moments all shopping around him had ceased. Baskets and trolleys were set aside. People were converging and saying Kate's name, and somehow in no time at all it was generally known that she was 3, that she was last seen at the checkout, that she wore green dungarees and carried a toy donkey. So this paragraph moves through quite a few different bits first. Firstly, we've got Stephen's fear. And then we've got all of the other shoppers joining in, baskets and trolleys set aside. So then moves to sort of focusing on everybody. And then finally it returns to a focus on Kate. Kate's name, she was 3, and that she carried a toy donkey. So all of this, it returns to Kate at the end. So it's almost like the text comes back to where it started. In the middle bit, she's there, and this then contrasts, which is what I've written there. It contrasts with she was gone. In the middle, she's gone. And then by the end, I suppose up until this point here, then it's only Stephen that's aware that she's gone, and the focus is very much on Stephen. And then by the end, everyone is aware that she's gone, and we return to this focus on Kate. The strange thing is here, she's being described, but she's not actually there. Whereas at the beginning, she's not really described, but she is there. So this is quite a complicated extract, I think, to think about in terms of structure, almost partly just because of the way it's set out, that it's not divided into sort of smaller paragraphs that allow you really to focus. But I would go back over it now and think about, where is it focusing on Stephen? Where is it focusing? Stephen's the dad. Where is it focusing on Kate? Where is it inside the supermarket? Where is it outside the supermarket? Where is it focusing on the sort of the supermarket as a whole? And where is it kind of going internal and focusing on Stephen's thoughts and feelings and what's going on inside his head? Okay, and that should give you enough to be able to come to the lesson with lots of ideas ready to write about structure.